Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this month's Glow Heartfulness webinar. We wish you all a very safe stay, a safe self-isolated stay during this difficult time of infection, and we wish a speedy recovery to all of you for those who have been affected. So today on the Glow Heartfulness webinar, we have Helle Laursen from Denmark who's going to speak to us about compassion in the spiritual way. Helle specializes in compassion-based approaches to enhance emotional resilience in groups, individuals, and in organizations. Her primary focus of expertise is caregivers, private as well as professionals. She also runs a company called Nordic Compassion, where she delivers online classes and also live workshops. In addition to this, she also teaches in the Center for MSc in USA. She has been a student and practitioner of heartfulness meditation for 20 years and is a valued facilitator for heartfulness workshops. So today what she's going to talk about is how compassion can help us. So heartfulness meditation is known to calm the mind, but at times it can still be difficult because even though we are either seasoned practitioners or new practitioners of heartfulness meditation, our mind tends to have this tendency to be more reactive than responsive. The emotions play a lot of havoc. So it is imperative that we inculcate a healthy attitude towards ourselves. Compassion can be this healthy attitude to calm ourselves down, to give ourselves some slack. So thank you for joining us today, Helle. It's been a good, nice and wonderful chat with you before the start of this webinar. And best wishes to every one of you in Denmark around you for a healthy and safe life. So let's start with the first question. What do you think compassion is?
Well, thank you for inviting me to this talk, Purnima. And so I'd like to start with just saying that the heartfulness practice that we do is basically where we connect ourselves with the ultimate, right? We bridge our humanness with the source, if you could say so, where compassion is more of the art of staying human on this path, living with an open heart. So let me just share a few screens here for you. Let me take this one. And so, yeah, do you see the screen now? I am hoping so. Right, so to define compassion.
Yeah, I didn't see the screen. It's
good. So what I'd like us to do today is to talk a little bit more explicitly about what compassion actually is and how it can benefit us while we are on this spiritual path, and even if we are not yet, you know, how compassion can benefit us in practicing and in becoming even more human and living with a more human heart. And so the first part of this talk today will be talking about what compassion is and what it's not. And then afterwards, I'll try to point to a few kind of places where compassion practice touches on heartfulness practice and how they kind of support each other, if you could say so. But let's talk about compassion explicitly first. And the reason that I'm using this word explicit, talking about compassion, is that it's very implicit in all of what we do in Heartfulness, right? The whole organization we have in Heartfulness is an act of compassion, basically. It's what we offer in Heartfulness, both in the hotspot centers, in local centers, as well as in ashrams all over the world, is basically an act of service towards humanity. That's an act of compassion. It's lessening the suffering in human beings when we become disconnected from our source, right? So compassion is very much inherent in everything that we do in Heartfulness. It's very much inherent in the practice we do and what we try to come about as well. So when we talk about compassion more explicitly, it's seen not so much from a heartfulness point of view, but more from a research point of view and from a human experience point of view. So that's the first part that I'll like to share with you. So compassion is, if we take the definition by Dalai Lama, the wish that all sentient beings may be free from suffering, right? And Paul Gilbert is a professor in the UK who is the founder of compassion-focused therapy, and he defines compassion as the deep awareness of suffering and the wish to alleviate it. Right? So in both of those definitions are the actual noticing that something is suffering or someone is suffering, and the wish to alleviate that, or to lessen that, or to free someone from suffering. So that is the kind of an easy way of defining what compassion is. Another more poetic definition of compassion, why can I not? Oh, there it is this one. So this is the poetic expression of the same. When the sunlight of loving kindness meets the tears of the rain of suffering, a rainbow of compassion emerges. Right. So that points to saying that we need both the wish to alleviate, or the kindness, the support, the reaching out to someone in the midst of noticing that suffering, and then that is the compassion. Right. So when we talk about compassion from a human experience point of view, it's basically dealing with what is difficult in being human, the suffering, the difficult emotions, the getting overwhelmed, the fear, the uncertainty that we face on the path of just living a normal human life. And so compassion is how we address those parts of human life, the difficult parts. So that is compassion when we define it as such. Another way of saying what compassion is basically that it's a courageous attitude towards suffering. It's the wanting to be kind even when the tears of suffering are there. Right, so, whoops. Oh, let me just take this next slide here. So for this reason, we also call compassion our mammalian instinct, because we all have the ability to be compassionate. It's part of our DNA as human beings. And what it does is basically that it creates safety, it connects us, it soothes. And this is why, we have all experienced this from our parents as growing up, because we basically wouldn't have survived if our parents did not manage to give us compassion to a certain degree. It's imperative for our nervous system to calm down, to be rebalanced. It's what parents do automatically if a child is upset. It's reaching out, it's being the safety, it's connecting with the child, it's soothing that upsetness or sadness that might be there. So compassion is not something that we need to train as something that is different from us. It's already within us. It's already an ability, and it's also a trait that we can enhance and that we can strengthen. So that is also a way to define what compassion is. So if we look even further into what is compassion, then it consists of these three components. Goodwill, which is also the kindness, the reaching out, the wishing to do something about a difficult situation. It's also the perspective taken, which is also called the common humanity perspective, which means the noticing that this suffering is a human normal reaction in such a given circumstance, right? That is the perspective of common humanity. So it's having another perspective on the suffering, and then it is the awareness, it's the noticing what is actually there. So let me give you a small example that I'm sure you can relate to from everyday life, of how these three different parts of compassion actually are expressed in our everyday life. So imagine that you walk down the street and you meet your neighbor or a good friend or a colleague or someone, and you can see that someone is upset or not of his or her best today. So what will automatically happen in such a situation is that you'll be a little bit more alert or aware. You might be saying something like, "Hey, what's up?" Or you look upset. "Is everything okay?" That is a normal everyday expression of this awareness. We become a little bit more alert when we see something happening. At the same time, even if you talk with that someone for only half a minute or something, it is likely that you'll hear yourself say something along the lines of, oh, hey, I get that you're upset about that. I would be as well if she had done so to me, or if that had happened in my life. That is the perspective. That is the awareness of this is a normal human reaction in such a given circumstance. And you could also probably very easily hear yourself say something along the lines of, oh, why don't you come over for a cup of tea a little later? Or can we talk about this tomorrow? Or who's helping you? So those like small everyday sentences, hey, what's up? I get how you're feeling, and how can I help you? Or who's helping you? Or do you want to connect so we can talk further? Those are everyday expressions of these three components that are needed, all of them, for someone to experience us as compassionate in that given circumstance. And so we need all three components, right? Because if you're meeting me and you're the one being upset today, and I come along walking, but I have my my nose down in my cell phone and I'm chatting with my kids or someone else, or I'm talking on the phone, then I might be saying the same things. I might be saying, oh, hey, you look upset, what's up? Or I might be expressing all of these three components, but I'm having part of my awareness somewhere else. So you will not be experiencing me as compassionate in that instance. I might be saying the right things, but I'm not there, right? So there's no connection. So we need all three components. All three of them need to be there for us to experience someone or a situation to be compassionate, right? So that is when we dive a little bit further down into what is compassion, this is what we define it as, that we need these three components. So basically, all of this is saying that compassion is a courageous attitude. It's being and staying fully aware, no matter what suffering we meet in others or in ourselves. And it's with that awareness, it's relating to that with a perspective taking and with a intention of goodwill, with a perspective of the common humanity and an intention of alleviating that suffering, but all the time holding that in a huge embrace of awareness, noticing everything that is happening there, right? So we can talk about self-compassion, or maybe we could call it inner compassion, because this is how we react toward ourselves. How can we, or how is this attitude, of this courageous attitude of noticing, of being aware of suffering and relating to the sufferer, how can we use that ourselves? And that is where we talk about this inner compassion, or or self-compassion. And we can define that in the exact same way as anything else. When we talk about compassion, it's just directed toward ourselves. And so Christine Neff, who is the researcher who started a lot of she did the scale that we use today in research of how to define our levels of compassion. She defines self-compassion as this: it's caring for ourselves when we suffer as we would care for someone we love. So basically, it's doing what we already find an easy time doing towards someone else, but directing that toward ourselves, turning it around and looking at ourselves as well. Or you could say it's like expanding the circle of who we meet with compassion to also include ourselves, right? So it's about warming up this relationship. When we meet someone we care for who is upset and we are compassionate toward that one, we warm up that relationship with the courage of noticing what is happening, the awareness to hold that suffering, and wishing to stay in that connection with warmth and with gentleness and with an intention of supporting that situation. Self-compassion is the exact same thing. We need the awareness. We need the courage to notice what is actually happening within myself, and warming up the relationship toward ourselves. And this is important in mental health for an important number of reasons, as I'll go over in these next few moments. So let's first take a quick look and a little illustration here that kind of sums up why this is important, the relationship we have with ourselves. Usually, we could say that our plans are like, well, I'm here and I'd like to go there. That's we know pretty much where we want to go or what we would like to do. I'd like to do my daily practice of heartfulness every day. I'll do my daily cleaning. I'll do everything right. I'll eat clean and healthy, and I'll be healthy and strong in the face of whatever meets my way. And then the lower part of this illustrates kind of how that usually looks for us, right? Our plans are not as smooth. We don't set the plans. You know, we meet all sorts of struggles along the way, and usually we become reactive. We like we don't like all of what we meet and how we have to react, and we become reactive because that is what we do as human beings when something is threatening or seems to be somewhat that could be challenging for us. Then we become reactive. Our nervous system simply goes into the fight and flight response. Right, so the universe plans, the life's plan for us are always more complicated than what we hope for, right? And there are a lot of adversities we need to look out for in the path along that way, as in all of Europe or in all of most of the planet. Just now we are facing this coronavirus, you know, which is definitely not something that we plan. We don't plan for adversity to somehow, we hope for it not to happen, and then we get a bit surprised every time it happens. That's more the normal human response to this. So the self-compassion practice is basically also the same way as compassion towards others. It's about expanding the awareness so that we can stay fully present, so that we can stay fully alert of what is happening, because that is needed for us to notice when we shut down, when we are not living with that open heart that we would aspire to, or that we would like to also in heartfulness practice. So that we need to be courageous to notice, oh gosh, I was reactive once again. Or, God, I was hoping that this wasn't happening, and then I got upset with someone because this was difficult for me to handle, or it was difficult for me to be fully aware in that upsetness that I was experiencing. So self-compassion is basically practicing being more mentally and emotionally flexible so that we don't react as much, so that we can be more consciously and aware in our reactions in everyday life towards ourselves and towards others. And so we need to practice that flexibility within ourselves, because I can only be flexible towards you to the degree that I can actually be aware of what a situation does to myself. So the limits for my ability to be compassionate toward anyone else, those limits are within me, right? In heartfulness, we would call that there's some scars that we need to clean away, but we need to be able to notice that something is closing us down so that we can respond differently. That would be what we say in compassion training. So basically a small reflection exercise that we could everyone do here on the webinar just
So,
now.
excuse me, Helle, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Before you proceed on with your exercise, I'm just clarifying. So I had this idea that self-compassion is also something which is a self-centered approach to the aspect of compassion on ourselves. But you clarify that it's not a self-centered approach, but it's actually a very vital need for ourselves to be self-compassionate to ourselves, which gives us the ability to be compassionate to others.
Exactly. And actually, thank you for mentioning that, because maybe we could just take a few more slides before we do this small reflection exercise. Oh God, what is happening here? Because there are some misgivings about self-compassion. And this is basically what you're addressing. So thank you for that, because this is important. If our mind gets stuck in all of this, then we don't have this space within to actually notice what's happening. So some of the misgivings when I ask people around, and also this has been done a lot of research into this, that one of the most important are, as you said, that I become more selfish, more self-centered. You could also say I become more self-pitiful. A lot of people would say, you know, it sounds kind of bad, this self-compassion, because it'll be just be pity me, pity me. Other people would say, oh, I'll be weak, or I'll become more arrogant, you know, if I practice the self is all the time, or maybe it'll undermine my motivation, or I'll be just sugarcoating, you know, we have to be so sweet and nice to everyone all the time that it'll not be a real authentic connection. So these are the main misgivings of self-compassion. And let me just touch very briefly on this. There's a lot to say about it. But basically, we do not become more self-pitiful because we are actually practicing the opposite. When we do compassion toward ourselves, we need to have those three components, right? The awareness of noticing what's happening, the perspective of common humanity, and the goodwill, the intention of kindness, which is also sometimes asking for help when we talk about self-compassion. But it's not self-pity. And it's not self-pity because we practice the perspective of common humanity. So even if I get caught up in reactivity, I get angry, or I get sad, or I get scared, then the self-compassion would remind me that any other human being in this situation would be likely to have those same emotions, right? So self-pity would be, it's me and it's what I go through that is the worst. And this is kind of what makes me stand apart from everyone else, because I'm going through something that is worse than everyone else and others don't really understand me. That is the self-centeredness, the perspective of common humanity that reminds me that it's not just me, everyone would react like this, so I need to take care of that, because I'm just being human, I'm just being reactive like any other human in this situation would be fearful or finding it difficult to navigate in uncertain and new circumstances. So research shows that we do not become self-pitiful, we become better at perspective taking, and we become better at being conscientious and knowing what we go through is just like others. So we actually become a lot better at taking full responsibility for our own situation. So that's kind of some of the, why it's not self-pity. Also, it does not undermine motivation, because it actually is long-term motivation to be compassionate toward ourselves. If we usually we become motivated, or we motivate ourselves being self-critic. I have to do a little bit more, I should have done more today. But this basically just makes it more difficult for us to connect deeper within, also in our meditation. And in the long run, it undermines, because it's basically motivation by fear. If I don't do this, then I'm not good enough, or I should be doing more, because then he'd like me, my boss would like me, what I do better, or whatever. So what self-compassion can help us do is to motivate ourselves, not with self-criticism, but with support, with acknowledging this is difficult. Maybe you should have done better. Maybe you should have prepared a little bit more. Maybe you should put in some more hours. But this is what is needed for you to be able to do this. So the self-compassion is basically supportive in the long run of, also research shows that it's easier for us to do long-term lifestyle changes, like losing weight or taking care of our diabetes, or anything else that takes years for us usually. So that becomes easier for us the more we become aware of self-compassion. We do not become selfish and indulgent for these reasons, because we basically become better at making long-term decisions, not short-term decisions. And you can see this in the research as well, that you become better at asking for help, asking for support, going to the doctor, and all these parts that are the long-term factors of being able to take care of ourselves and be responsible for our lives. That is what the research shows is the link between self-compassion and mental health. So we do not end up on the couch eating ice cream all day, or being in other ways.
Thank you. Thank you, Helle. That was very imperative that I asked that question, because I also had received a few questions on email, which was also, can I eat ice cream on the couch?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
clarifying, and yeah, let's move on to the next aspect.
Okay. So actually, I was, let's do just a 2-minute reflection exercise just now, before I speak a little bit more into why it's important or how it works. And the reflection exercise is just kind of a way to try to make everyone a little bit more aware of our automatic and habitual reactivity. Right. So I'll ask everyone here who are joining us here to remember a time where a friend of yours came to you because she or he had met something difficult had happened, or a misfortune, or failed at something that was important to them, some situation that was difficult for that friend. And just give it a minute of thought on how is your usual and normal automatic reactivity in that situation. What do you say to that friend? How do you respond? What tone of voice do you use? How are your nonverbal gestures or anything else that you say, and what is your intention, right? So try to remember a situation as such, and maybe jot down, if you have pen and paper in front of you, a few automatic responses for you when it's a friend who comes up having experienced something that was difficult. And just seeing the situation for you, or remembering such a situation. And then letting that situation go, and then remembering a situation recently where it was you who was in a difficult situation. It was you who failed at something, or didn't live up to your own standards, or just met some adversity or situation that was different for some reason. And how do you typically respond to yourself? What do you typically say to yourself when it is you who has failed at something or met something that was difficult? What tone of voice do you use toward yourself? What is your intention in that situation? What are the nonverbal or other gestures that you do? How do you typically respond toward yourself? And now look at those two situations and see if there are any differences. Are there any differences in how you respond to your friends, and in terms of how, or in comparison with how you respond to yourself?
Yeah,
There, there might be.
it's
Is there for
so
you?
different. I
Yeah.
never thought of it this way.
So what would be one of the differences for you?
I think the most important thing is I'm way more harsher with myself than with my friend. And I didn't realize it until now. I mean, my God, it's really so surprising.
So we can be harsh in what we say, or we can be harsh in the tone of voice that we use, right? And most of us actually, thank you for sharing this, because a lot will be able to recognize that same issue. We might have different things that stand out as the difference in how we react towards others or ourselves. But for most of us, research suggests just under 90% of us do find a difference. And we do find it easier to being supportive toward others than ourselves, right? So far, the majority of us actually can recognize what you were just sharing here. And I'd say in my live courses, it is usually more than 95 or the 98% who finds this difference in how they respond to others or how they respond to themselves. So let's look a little bit further into why that is. Let me just touch, before I do a little bit more on the why, let me touch very briefly on the self-compassion, because basically this whole practice of being self-compassionate gives us less of all the stuff that is difficult: anxiety, stress, depression, rumination, avoidance, burnout, and we become more resilient, more mental and physically healthy. Basically, we become better at coping with failures and building relationships. And what is maybe more important or more surprising for some is that we become better in compassion and empathy for others. So this is basically the reasons that we can benefit from knowing and practicing more self-compassionate, that we basically become better at supporting everyone around us. It is the very opposite of being self-centered. And so what we do, what self-compassion basically reminds of us, is reconnecting with ourselves all the time, especially when life is difficult, so that we can stay open-hearted instead of closing down and start blaming or being difficult towards others, yelling at others, or other things like that that we might find ourselves in when we are really under stress, right? So we become better at meeting pain and difficulty in ourselves as well as in others. And this is one of the reasons why it's important, or why it can be beneficial. So let's look a little bit more into the why it is most of us do find a difference in how we relate to ourselves and to others. Basically, we have, this can see animal instinct within that wants to eat, survive, and reproduce. And what we do in heartfulness practice is basically trying to, as Babaji said, going from being animal human to being human being, right? So we try to evolve, but we still have these reptilian brain parts of ours that basically are responsible for our habitual reactivity. And so that is what we are up against to a certain extent. And this is why it can be difficult, even when we are seasoned meditators, that we can come into situations in our lives where we can be overtaken by emotional reactivity or thoughts or a difficulty, and not being certain how to respond, because we still have these parts of us that react automatically. So you could say that we, as human beings, we have what is the red curve here, the new brain. We have a way to ruminate or to go through situations again and again. Where if we were a zebra and there was a threat, and like a lion attacking us, then half an hour after we'd survived that and the lion was gone, we'd be completely at peace again. As human beings, what we do is basically we run over that threat again and again, and we put that into the future, like making imagery of how difficult the future can be. We start becoming self-critical. Why didn't I see this coming? What should I have done differently? And what we do in that is basically we stay in arousal. We stay disconnected from our heart. We stay disconnected from our authentic selves, and that makes it more difficult for us to connect with everyone else around us. So what we do in meditation is basically calming down this reactivity. And that's the same effect that the practice of self-compassion can have. So this is basically where it's supportive of heartfulness, or the heartfulness practice, that sometimes it can be difficult to meditate because there are too much reactivity, too much fear, too much uncertainty, too much whatever sadness within. Then self-compassion can be a gateway to calm this mind down so that we can reconnect, and through that we can go into deep meditation. So another way of saying this is, if I put it up in this little table, is that the stress response that we are basically talking about here, the fight, flight, or freeze, that is our reptilian brain, and it's our automatic habitual response. That is activated in today's society not only by the lion or other threats coming out from outside, it's also activated by how we relate to ourselves. And in today's society, we are a lot more, at risk in terms of comparing ourselves with others, like we do typically on social media. Some people have good holidays, they have nice friends, they do healthy workouts, they do healthy breakfast, and what do I do? Then I see the opposite of what everyone else do. So the stress response turned inward can be like the self-criticism, the isolation of feeling different from others, or the overwhelmed by thoughts, what in research is being called rumination, that the thoughts just kind of keep continuing. We could call it brooding as well. And the three components of self-compassion that I mentioned before are basically the antidotes to this stress response. So they are the ones that can make our fight-flight response calm down quite fast, even if it is difficult for some of us. It might be difficult when we are very reactive, but meditation can do the same thing. But this is basically the physiology part of what self-compassion does. Self-compassion, or the self-kindness, is what I, in the earlier slide, called the goodwill. And that is the antidote to the fight or the self-criticism. The perspective of common humanity was called perspective taking in the earlier slide. That is the antidote to feeling isolated or different from others, or my flight response physically. And mindfulness, which was called awareness in the earlier slide, is the antidote to being overwhelmed or caught up in my own emotions and thought patterns. And that is the antidote to the freeze response in my physical body. So basically that is the, just kind of sums up what is compassion and what is it not. Compassion are these three components when they meet each other, when they're all there. And another way of expressing these three components is to say that it's developing a loving, connected presence with myself in any given circumstance. And from there, I can connect and stay open, loving, connected presence for everyone else around me. So that's kind of covers a very quick walkthrough of what is compassion, what is it not. Are there any things that we could clarify or I could clarify here, Punina, or does it make sense so far? So I take that as it makes sense so far. No further questions from people just now. All right, so let's look at how this is relevant for heartfulness practitioners, or how it's relevant for everyone on the path into heartfulness as a practice, right? So compassion and heartfulness are basically, as I at least try to talk about it here explicitly, two different things. They are intertwined, and compassion is inherent in everything we do in the heartfulness practice, right? And so I'll try to kind of bridge them and talk a little bit about where they touch. But basically, when we talk about explicitly about compassion, we talk about it from a point of the psychological research. We talk about it as the wish to alleviate human suffering and lessening ego reactivity so that we can be more present in any circumstance. And in heartfulness, we talk about becoming one with the source, and developing humility, which is another way of saying lessening the ego reactivity, right? And compassion actually comes, what the research shows in today and what is being researched into is basically that an understanding of compassion as it comes from the Buddhist psychology, which again, in term, the Buddhist practice comes from Patanjali. So basically, far back, if we go back in history, heartfulness and compassion have sort of the same origin. But today, it's kind of bridging the Western psychology research with the Buddhist practice. So that's just another way of kind of bridging the two of them here. So let me go through a few kind of, I took some pictures of these roadsides in Kanha recently when I was there. And so basically when I talk about compassion as being something that addresses the humanity of us, the difficulty in being human, that is basically also what we do in heartfulness, right? We talk about evolution as something that is growth, change, and transformation. But as human beings, we sometimes find it quite difficult to actually let ourselves be transformed. It feels more safe for us to stay within our mental understanding of what is right and wrong, which is what we try to, get out of in heartfulness. But it can be quite difficult as human beings, because we as human beings in our mind, we'd like to just know that we are on the right path, kind of thing. So compassion is addressing the character change, as Master Charity would used to call it, right? That with all those habitual patterns that we need to let go of, all of these habitual likes and dislikes that we all do every day, that letting them fall away is basically one of the places where heartfulness practice and self-compassion practice touch, because that is what they both intend for us to do. In heartfulness, we say that we should take miseries as gifts from above, and that requires a willingness for us. That points to this aspect of transformation, letting ourselves be transformed. And so in self-compassion is not a spiritual practice as such. It doesn't talk about miseries as gifts from above, but it talks about the importance of turning toward the miseries, the importance of noticing and being aware that we are misery, because if we are not aware of it, there's no way that we can stop our habitual reactivity, right? So that's one touch point between the two. Another one is this prayerful meditation we do before we fall asleep in Heartfulness. And what this prayerful meditation basically touches on is that all of the wordings here are the we, it's our advancement, it's bringing us up to that stage. You know, here we do not talk about, I would like to come up to that stage and I would like to not be slave of my wishes. We address that this is what happens and this is what is needed for every human being, that we all tend to be slaves of our wishes, that we, for all of us, that puts bar to our advancement. And for all of us, we need that something else from deeper inside to bring us up to that stage. So this is another way, this is basically pointing toward the what I before called the perspective of common humanity, right? We have that in the prayer here, that it's not just me, my, and how I can evolve. It's basically all of us together, you know, in unity, which is difficult at the same time for us, isn't it? So that's another bridge. One of the other road signs said this: flexibility is humility, which is a little bit of what I've said, that the research shows that practicing self-compassion, or the ability to being self-compassionate, basically enhances mental and emotional flexibility. And that makes us more humble. That makes it easier for me to see someone else's point of view. That makes it easier for me to understand what is happening in another human being. And that is why we can see in the research that the more we enhance our ability to be compassionate toward ourselves and our inner experience, the easier it is for us to be compassionate and supportive toward everyone else. The more empathic we basically become. So another touch point between compassion and heartfulness is that we in Heartfulness talk about this voice of the heart. It's also, Dachi talked about it as moral character, or the Aklach, or something like that recently. And that is the listening deeply, right? The listening deeply in every situation. What is the right thing to do? To be able to listen to that feeble voice of the heart, we need to be quiet. We need to quiet the mind. And so that's the practice of heartfulness, basically. And that is where we all find it troublesome, because we all have a difficult time sometimes listening to that voice of the heart. And what self-compassion would say would be that we need to address all of the noise and all of the reactivity, because when we take care of ourselves as the ones also suffering, then we can have that stillness come forth, right? So that we need to not make the thoughts and the emotional reactivity wrong. We need to address it. We need to be courageous. We need to notice it, turn toward it. And when we do that, it falls away. That is basically the practice of self-compassion as well. Acceptance is stressed in heartfulness in all ways, in a different of many ways, but also very implicit. In compassion training, we talk about acceptance very explicit, as you know, there are certain steps emotionally. In emotional acceptance, there are certain steps that we need to take, that we need to get out of our resistance towards something that we don't like, so that we can move toward a deeper and deeper acceptance, which is basically, we can only do that once we let ourselves be transformed, because the process of acceptance is the process of being flexible, and the process of getting out of this stuckness of my mind that I find myself in all the time, or that we, all of us, find ourselves in all the time. So we say in self-compassion practice that what we resist basically persists, right? If I don't want to be self-centered, then it's basically just enhances my self-centeredness. You know, everything that I don't want to acknowledge that I can be it sometimes, that comes up and basically persists in me as a personality character, or as we have Hobson here saying that reality continues to ruin my life. You know, that's kind of my expectations were that this was going to be smooth, because now I found the path in my life, and then I wanted everything to fall into place. But we keep meeting adversity, right? And then what it says here on the left part, the pain times resistance equals the suffering, right? So pain is inevitable as human beings, but resistance is the mental component that we put upon it. And we wish it was different. So we meet emotional pain, we wish that was different, and that that actually enhances the suffering that we experience. And in Heartfulness, we would also say that we actually try to accept miseries as gifts from above, meaning that that we don't try to change ourselves. We are as we are, and that is how we can come forth. But we need to get out of the mind. We need to, so that we don't get stuck in it, as Calvin and Hobbes here, with that reality that ruins everything for us. So in another way of saying that, in Heartfulness, we talk about the evolution of consciousness and the subtle bodies that we have. And the practice of self-compassion basically goes into, soften up that ego subtle body. So that's kind of, if you have a larger point of view of what Heartfulness is and what we do in Heartfulness, then this is the tiny bit of it that self-compassion can address. So practicing compassion to others as well as ourselves is basically practicing this mental and emotional flexibility. It's practicing the awareness of the inner habitual reactivity that I have and that everyone else have. And it's taking full responsibility for that. That is where it bridges to the character change, to the becoming more flexible over years or over time, so that I can take full responsibility for my own actions. And we do that through complete and 100% acceptance, which is difficult, but that acceptance is basically not being identified with my mental and emotional reactivity. We all have that because we have an ego. We need a mental understanding of who we are and how we navigate in the world. So acceptance is the practice of widening that, softening that identification, so that we can feel connected to everyone and not only our mental habitual reactivity. So last time I was in Canada, there was another practitioner who gave me this little poem and said that that was a Danish Abiyasi from way back that brought this back to Denmark, and having received that from charities. So no one knew today if these words actually were charities or if it was something that he passed on. But I find it to be a sweet kind of pointing toward the awareness that bridges the practice of self-compassion and heartfulness. So these words read, "Be aware and everything comes to you. Open your heart and let all things pass through. Of all the things, choose the better part. The only art is the art of the heart." So to be able to have this awareness where we can let things pass through, we need to soften our ego. We need to make it more transparent so that things can actually, experiences and adversities and difficulties can actually pass through, so that we can stay connected underneath all of that reactivity that we have. And that is basically the art of the heart that these words point towards. So I think actually those were, that was the last slide. That was, what I had to share. And there are more free resources also in English at my website. If any one of you are interested, then you can go there. So let me just kind of stop the sharing here, and then let me hear if there has been any other questions that came up or were sent to you, Purnima, as we went along through this.
So thank you so much, Helle. That was an amazing webinar, and thank you for bridging the aspect between compassion and the spiritual way. I have a question from a participant who's asking this. She's asking, how can she be compassionate to herself, and how can she be compassionate to somebody who is trying to be cunning or conniving or having these not so positive qualities, because this kind of presents a very difficult situation or a very difficult scenario, and it's not a natural thing for us to feel compassion towards people who are exhibiting such qualities. So if you can throw some light on this, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. And that's a wonderful question. There's a lot to say about that. So first of all, for us to be able to be compassionate to someone else who is difficult for us, or who continues to do something that's not conducive behavior, we need to this is an example of where we need to be compassionate to ourselves at first, because if I do not notice and if I cannot stay aware of what that situation does to me, that he or she continues to be cunning or be inappropriate in whatever way, if I cannot be fully aware of what that actually does to me, then I will be habitual reactive in most circumstances, right? Then I will not come across as compassionate. So that's the one thing that we need to turn the awareness away from that other one that is doing something we don't like or don't agree with, and then taking responsibility for our own reactivity in that situation. So that's the most difficult part, right? It's easier for us to say, well, you should do differently, or I think she should do something, or he should never say that. But the difficult part is turning inside and noticing, what does this do to me, and freeing ourselves from that reactivity, because then we can be free to decide what to do. So that's one part of the answer. But another part of the answer is actually a whole webinar in itself, because that is the fact that what we've talked about, or how I've introduced compassion here, and especially self-compassion, is what we call the yin aspect of compassion. It's the turning towards something that is difficult. It is the embracing and opening our heart towards something that is difficult, which is important. That's what I need to notice what's happening in here. And that's the reason for me to be reactive. But the other part of compassion that we haven't talked about yet is what is called fierce compassion, or the yang part of compassion. And so that is usually, like I had that mammalian picture of the koala bears, with the little tiny one. The other picture that I would usually show at the same time would be the tiger mother with her small cubs. And you know that if we get too close to that tiger mother, she would attack. She wouldn't think twice, right? So that is what we call fierce compassion. Fierce compassion is the standing up for what is right. Fierce compassion is the saying no. Fierce compassion is saying, hey, I'm not allowing you to overstep my boundaries again and again and again. I need to let you know what is happening here. Please stop what you do. So the fierce compassion is the protective, it's the motivating ourselves to do something that is difficult, and it's the providing ourselves with whatever is needed, or our loved ones, like the tiger mother would provide her cubs with protective space, right? So those are the components of the fierce compassion. So you do not become, the compassion is not being overly sweet. So it's not being overly sweet to someone who is cunning or distracting, or just being, not very sweet, or not very conductive in behavior. It would not be compassionate to go, oh yes, I have to be so sweet with you, even though that you do this to everyone all the time. That's not compassion. That's just sugarcoating whatever is happening, right? So compassion is more of having that courage to actually notice, clean up inside, what are my own reactivity, and noticing all of what is happening in the situation, and from that point of view, trying to find a way to navigate in the situation. And that sometimes we need that fierce compassion, the setting boundaries, the saying no, the whatever. So there's a lot more to talk about if we are to dive more into what compassion actually is. I hope that kind of stands clear.
Thank you so much, Helle. That was a very sweet answer. Fierce compassion is something which is totally new, and thank you for introducing that thought process, that idea with me and with the viewers. And I hope this answers the question of this participant. There is also another question which is equally interesting and important, I believe, and you sort of answered it in the previous question, but I just still feel like sharing it with you.
Please do.
So there is this wonderful sister who's asking us, in times of oppression, how can I alleviate myself from the situation? So to be compassionate to myself or to be compassionate to the oppressor is one thing, but how can I practically rectify the situation in such a way to also keep my boundaries intact, and to also make sure that this kind of oppressive situation doesn't come again. So I know that you did answer this a bit in the previous question by talking about fierce compassion, but if there is something else you would like to add, then please do so.
Well, and I think I'll just kind of underline that the fierce compassion, the yang part of compassion, as well as the softer part, the yin part of compassion, that they need to go together. So that, you know, if we find ourselves in a difficult situation with someone oppressing, or someone being someone a difficult someone that doesn't change behavior, then we need again to take care of, or to notice, what does this do to me, right? And because we would usually in that situation put all of our focus on that other one, you know, he should do differently, or shouldn't do like this, she should do like that, because this is not good for me or anyone else. You know, we would kind of have all of our focus outside. So again, it's turning the awareness inside, to noticing the depth of the suffering of this situation that I find myself in. And so answers to what to do not necessarily come easy. And compassion practice is not about finding ways to fix or do something in a situation. It's basically about opening our heart and healing the emotional stuff that is the habitual reactivity, so that we are not affected by the habitual reactivity in our response. And from that, a little bit more connected with ourselves point of view, we can hopefully find the right time to set a boundary, or to say no, or to ask for help from someone else, right? So compassion is all about our internal reactivity. It's not about what we can make others change, because other people have to change themselves. And we all need willingness to do that, which is difficult. It's always difficult for us to change. So compassion does only point towards the how can I take care of myself? When do I need to be the tiger mother? When do I need to be the koala bear? You know, and I can be both towards myself, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Helle. That was a very enlightening answer. So there are a few more questions, but I would like to mention to the participants that if you can write to us with your questions to glow@heartfulness.org. I repeat, GLOW at heartfulness.org. Helle would answer all your questions. So at the beginning of this webinar, we mentioned that we would be having a free experiential heartfulness session, and now is probably the right time to start it. And Helle, being a heartfulness trainer herself, has offered to conduct this session. So let us go on to Helle's heartfulness session. Over to you, Helle.
Thank you, Purnima, and thank you for those wonderful questions from participants. So let's do a meditation together, and kind of as a walking into the meditation, I'd like us to start with the evening meditation, the prayerful meditation that we do before going to sleep. So I'll just say that aloud, and I'd like you to just kind of repeat it for yourself and sit with it for a few minutes, and then I'll let you know when the meditation will be starting. So let all of these words of compassion and whatever, let them roll off you, and maybe close your eyes, make yourself comfortable. Take a few deep breaths, and allowing yourself for these next 20 minutes or so to just be in meditation. And let's start with the prayerful meditation we do before falling asleep. Oh Master, thou art the real goal of human life. We are yet but slaves of wishes, putting bars to our advancement. Thou art the only God in power to bring us up to that stage. So sit with this for a few minutes, please. And then I'll let you know when we go into meditation. And so, from this place of prayerful meditation, let's start the meditation. Just turn toward your heart and turn toward the assumption of divine light being present in your heart. And let's start now. Yeah, that's all. Let's stop here.
Thank you so much, Helen, for the wonderful meditation session. For all our participants and viewers who are meditating for the first time today, we suggest that you can continue your heartfulness practice by logging on to heartfulness.org, and you can write to us at info@heartfulness.org or at glow@heartfulness.org, and we shall share a few resources with you to continue this practice. To avail the services of a free heartfulness trainer, you can also log into heartspots.heartfulness.org. There are about 6,000 hotspots across the world which are heartfulness centers, and they are available in 130 countries. Uh, so during this time of lockdown, self-isolation, for the imminent health crisis, we suggest that you can also avail the mobile app called Hearts app, which is free for download on the App Store and the Google Play Store. About 10,000 trainers from across the world are logged in into the Hearts app at any point in time, and you can have a free heartfulness session immediately. You can also enroll for the 3 masterclass sessions from the Heartfulness website. These are conducted by Daji Kamleshji Patel, who is the global guide of Heartfulness meditation. This is the link through which you can access these 3 free masterclasses. So, how to keep yourself engaged during this time of staying at home and needing a support, needing a cushion to guide you through this difficult phase. You can go and enroll on this Udemy course, which is Meditation and Evolution of Consciousness with Daji. There are also a wonderful reading resources on the heartfulnessmagazine.com, which is free for download. You can also purchase the book theheartfulnesswheel.com or designingdestiny.com, written by Daji Kamleshji Patel. For feedback about this webinar, future webinar proposals, video archives of past webinars, any current queries or questions for Helle, for all of these, please write to glow@heartfulness.org and we shall reply immediately. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today, Helle. Thank you to all the participants who have joined us. And we wish you all a safe and happy and cheerful phase right now. And let us all give positivity to each other, optimism for each other, compassion for each other, albeit virtually. Thank you. Any closing thoughts, Helle?
No. Thank you, Purnima. And thank you to all the participants and the wonderful questions.